one of 6 states that continue to fund the way we fund. So I think that's we haven't changed this in 30 something years. I think it's appropriate, and I think we would all agree we need to at least consider this and look at this. There's no foregone conclusions. I think the data and the facts will lead us to what we need to do, if anything. But I think that I just want to make sure we understand we're all here. We need to come with open minds and listen and understand where we are, and then we'll go from there. So appreciate Chairman Orr's pushing this issue and to the forefront. And I appreciate all the members here because it's really important. It's very complicated, a lot of moving parts and pieces and things that will need to be considered. But this is a good way to start. And I appreciate everybody being here today. Thanks, sir.
Do we have any members online? Is there any? Okay. So just for your information, we are probably take June and July off, and we'll be looking at having our second meeting mid-August, third week of August, somewhere in there. And so that being said, there's no other comments. Mr. Fulford, the show is yours.
All right. My intention here is to provide you a 30,000-foot view of what a student-based versus resource-based funding system looks like. Actually lay out for you how our foundation program works. I think there's some misconceptions in terms of what people think is included and what's not. You should have a copy of pages from our spreadsheet, which is the local Board of Education section as well as the State Department section. There's some lines on there that are highlighted in a different color, and I'll get to those and explain to you why I'm showing you those separately. You should also have several pages from the budget document itself. It's about 10 pages total, showing you exactly the language that's in the budget with regarding the foundation program and the components that are used to build the foundation program. So I provided that to you. We can discuss that later on if you have any questions, but I just want to tell you what that was before I get started. So while you're here, you passed a resolution. You passed both a House joint and a Senate joint resolution to require the legislature to study the K-12 funding system and look at modernizing the system into a student-based model versus what it is right now, which is a resource-based model. Student-based funding allocates funds based on the number of students in a school system. That's about as simple as it can be, because it is. Most states do a flat amount per student and then add on top of that multipliers for various things, for special needs, for intellectual disabilities, for career tech, for at-risk students, and various other entities. So that's what a student-based system is. The resolution required you to meet and to have a report due to the governor and the speaker and the pro tem by February the 1st regarding any recommended changes that you want and legislation to implement those changes. House Resolution 263 passed the House, didn't pass the Senate. It basically would have formalized what you're doing here today, which was the two budget committees coming together to actually do the study. And so that, I just put that up for the rationale behind why you were here. That was the thought process. The resolution just didn't get through both houses. So what is a resource-based versus a student-based system? A resource-based system allocates funds based on the anticipated cost of resources, including salaries and benefits, including classroom instructional materials. Alabama is one of only 6 states that still uses a resource-based system. And I'll get into a little bit about what the components of that system are in just a minute. Student-based, as I just mentioned, allocates funds based on the number of students enrolled in a school district. In many states, additional funds are added for low-income students, again, as I mentioned earlier, disability or English language learners. 41 states use some form of a student-based funding model, including most of the ones around us. Georgia has a hybrid model. I've got a list of what those states have later on in the presentation. So our current funding model is called the Foundation Program. It's a formula-based system. It was developed in 1995. The act establishing the program was passed in 95. It was first implemented in 96. It was phased in over a period of years. The intent was to provide an equitable basic funding stream for K-12 schools throughout the state. At that time, it mandated a 10 mil equivalence in order to participate. We changed that later on. I'll get to that in a minute. Local school systems had to commit to the foundation program. In theory, how it worked was a poorer system operating with funds provided through the foundation program would have the essential elements that every other student, every other system had in the state. What it provides to each school.
Mr. Fulford?
Yes.
May I interrupt? Could I get one of our LFO staffers to ring upstairs to get copies of all this to distribute to the members, because our eyes are failing and that's a long way off, and plus it would be good to have. So if we could get copies run upstairs for those in attendance today, and even those that are not here, just to take them to their offices.
We'll make some copies, but we're going to send the presentation to both Karen and Dalton to distribute to the members later on, who couldn't be here as well as you. Sorry about that. What the foundation programs provides to each school is a minimum number of teachers referred to as units, principal, assistant principals, librarians, and counselors, operations money, which is referred to as other current expenses, and basic financial support for classrooms in the form of textbooks, technology, professional development, library enhancement, and classroom materials and supplies. And also recently in 2021, we added a component for student growth. And so those things comprise the formula that builds the foundation program. The foundation program is funded by both state and local money. I think there's a common misunderstanding about that. Locals now have to levy 10 mills of property tax in order to be in the foundation program. There's no wiggle on that. It's not equivalency. Section 26908 of the Constitution required 10 mills. And again, it's important to note that it's not a state program. It's a state and local combined program partnership. And the foundation program for allocation for any school system is determined through the formula. And it's based solely on the number of students enrolled in ADM in that school for the previous year, as well as the divisors that you add in the budget document, and we'll get into that in just a few minutes. So the equity component of the foundation program is that the state and local percentages of funding vary from system to system. In other words, that 1 mil of school district property tax in Dallas County and Lowndes County is not worth as much as the 1 mil of property tax in a Mountain Brook, in a Baldwin County, in a Birmingham City, just because of the type of property that they have in those locations. So the state share is higher in the poorer systems. In other words, that 10 mil is not worth as much in a poor system as it is in more affluent systems. And so the state pays the difference to the locals. More affluent systems contribute a higher percentage of local monies. That's just how it works. That's the equity component. Affluence is determined solely by the value of that property, of that 1 mil of property tax. And regardless of the number of mills, the value of a single mill is contingent upon the value of the property in general. Like I said, those things vary widely throughout the state in terms of the value of the mill. Here's just an example of what that looks like. So without showing what the total cost of the program is, in a more affluent system where the property value is higher, might receive only 74% of their money from the state. That probably is even less in several of the instances of the higher property values of local places. In a less affluent system, they put up the 10 mills and the state pays the rest, and that's really all they have to offer. It's 90% covered by the state, and that on the left-hand side could be much less than that, and I'm sure it is. So here's the value of the 10 mills collectively throughout the state for 2024 is $715 million roughly, which is up from 687 in 23. I think that number is over 800 million for 2025. and this is the block that you see on your spreadsheet that says Education, K-12, local boards of education. How it's broken down, the foundation program for 24 made up 75% of that money. All the other programs, well, not all the other, transportation and the other programs are categorical grant programs. They're not within the formula, they're separate and apart. They give money to the local school systems just the same or in a similar fashion, but they're not a part of the actual formula to drive the foundation program. Public school fund is separate. And then there you see the foundation program, the local component of that is the 715 million.
Kirk, excuse me, Zach, can you kind of dumb this down just a little bit? Just go back to the 200,000 foot level where you were equalizing. Just kind of explain again. You gave the example where the local system might get 24% versus.
Yeah.
What are we equalizing to? Kind of explain how that number's
Right.
arrived.
So we'll simplify this. So you've got a local school system, two local school systems that have a similar total cost of the foundation program. Let's assume that total cost of the foundation program is $10 million. In a less affluent school system, what happens is the state pays the difference between the 10 mils and the total cost. So the total cost is 10 million. In a less affluent school system, they may only have 1 million of that they're paying from local. The state picks up 9 million. In a less affluent school system where the total cost is the same, or a more affluent school system where the total cost is $10 million is the same, they may pick up $3 million of the total cost with local money, and the state only gives them $7 million. So it works out to the fact that a local system whose millage is worth less than a system whose millage is worth more gets more from the state.
But the number you're equalizing to is a cost number.
Yes, the total cost is driven by the formula, and how much of that total cost is covered by the state versus the local is driven by the value of the local mills.
Right.
This is the full breakdown of what the foundation program was for 2024 and 2025. These are the components of the foundation program: salaries and fringe benefits, other current expenses. I'll get into what that is in just a minute. Classroom instructional support. These are on a per unit basis or a per pupil basis. It's a flat amount per unit. So for every unit a school gets, they get X amount. In this case, for student materials, $900, $500 for technology, $157.72 for library enhancement and so forth. And then we added the student growth component at the bottom. That is the foundation program. That's the total cost of the foundation program. And those are the inputs that go into driving the total cost of the foundation program. But there are other things that are funded. Like I mentioned earlier, there are other items, categorical support, categorical grants that are also included in the local boards of education funding on your spreadsheet as well as in the budget. The foundation program's the top line. Student nurse program is a categorical grant program that is not within the foundation program. It's a separate thing. Technology coordinators, transportation operations. Prior to the current foundation program, transportation was funded as part of the foundation program formula in the 1935 model. It was pulled out and allocated as a separate categorical grant program in the current system, which includes fleet renewal, current units, which are for the new and transitional charter schools now. It used to be for something else. At risk, Board of Adjustment, Career Tech O&M, all of those things are separate from the first line. The first line is the formula that everybody pays attention to and what I'm about to tell you about. Everything else is a part of the program. It's just not a part of the formula. So what drives the formula? Average daily membership for the first 20 days following Labor Day for the previous school year drives the formula. From that point, you divide the average daily membership by the divisor for each of the individual grade classes to get to the state earned units, the total units earned. Each school system's units will differ depending upon their makeup, depending upon the divisors used. The total ADMs for 2023 were 723,670. That's basically head count of school kids. That's not teachers, the teacher units associated with that was roughly 47,800. There's your divisors for fiscal year '24. K3, 14.25, 4 through 6, 20.06, 19.7 for 7 through 8, and grade 9 through 12 is 17.95. So what are other current expenses is also part of the formula that provides state financial support for non-certified personnel, school secretaries, cafeteria workers, custodians. It also includes money to pay utilities, operations, maintenance, substitute teachers, and anything basically other than debt. Our capital outlay can be funded from that line. And it's also done on a per unit basis. So the amount of units that you earn also gives the more money to the classroom to the LEA for that purpose. A local unit is funded entirely by the local LEA. Any teacher employed by the school system above the allocation determined through the divisor system, the state divisors, are called local units. Most of the local units are assigned to middle school and high school because they're much harder to get the specialty teachers into those areas. All costs associated with a local unit are paid by the local government. So this is separate and apart from the foundation program formula as far as the units. That's entirely done at the local level. So there are lots of things into this that we'll get into in a minute as far as what it does and doesn't capture. Here's one list of items that are not in the foundation. They're not in the formula. In fact, transportation, I mentioned this earlier, transportation, school nurses, technology coordinators, at-risk, math and science teacher program, none of those are a part of the formula that drives the basic allocation of funds to the LEAs. Also, what's not included in there, because they're also categorical grant programs, but they're under the State Department, the Reading Initiative, the Math and Science Technology Initiative, distance learning come through the State Department. They may be allocated in a similar manner based on ADM, but they are not in the foundation program. Similarly, you've got a special ed grant, high need special ed grant program. That's a State Department grant program. That's not in the foundation program. ELL is funded as a categorical grant program under the State Department. It is also not in the foundation program. I say all that to say there are lots of things that you fund for K-12 education that are outside of the scope of the foundation program, and certainly something that you'll have to consider if you go down the path of doing a student-based system. Weighted units, there are weighted units for special education as well as career tech. Career tech applies to grades 7 through 12, and the special education units, it's roughly 5% of the population needs special ed services, 2.5 times instructional assistance. That basically generates additional support for the LEAs, but that's not directly tied to a special ed teacher. The assumption being that the LEA on their own will make the initiative to spend the money directly related to special ed services. Public school fund, we have a 6.5 mills property tax. Three of those mills go into a public school fund, which is intended to be for capital outlay purposes. It requires a matching obligation from the local systems dependent upon the value of the mill in the system. So here is an example.
Could I stop you right there? Where do we stand with the data for determining special ed students, ELL, and the granular differences between, an ELL student that's had 2 years of English classes maybe, but still in the process, and then somebody that's very new?
From the education community behind me, but to my knowledge, the special education detailed data has not been gathered as of yet. They have overall special needs, they have overall that fall into certain categories, but as far as this person needs this level of service versus that person needs this and individual things, I don't think the data has been gathered at that level yet.
Is it going to be?
Getting a yes. Here's the thing, if you go down the path of a student-based system and you want to include a component that's based on the individual and special education needs of students, it will have to be gathered. So that's a bridge we have to cross to get you there if that's where you want to go. Other states and have done something similar, but they just did a flat multiplier on top of what they had, as opposed to trying to do what Tennessee did, which was target the individual various categories of need for the special ed students. On ELA, but we have a overall count of special needs students. It's just not broken down by the individual classes of need or what the services being provided are. Similarly, for the ELL, I don't think they have the information. Brandon says they can provide both of those to us. That's excellent. So,
Count by specific disability and count by EL status.
wonderful. So we're ahead of the game. He said they can provide that. This is Brandon from the State Department. They can provide that information, so they've got it. Okay, thank you. We're handing out copies of the presentation, and we're going to put that on our website under special reports, so it'll be available, and also we'll send it to Karen and Dalton to distribute to the members who aren't here. So I put this slide in there just for example purposes. I think there was Chairman Garrett had a question about how it actually played out. So here's the head count to start with. So the top part of that is the ADM of the system, which through the generates a total number of teachers, units for each one of the systems, number of principals, assistant principals, library, to get to the total number of units allowed for each one of those systems. On the far left, that's Mountain Brook's FY 2024. This is not something that we created. This is off the department's information that they send out to the school systems. Baldwin County in the center, Lowndes County on the right. Lowndes County would be considered less affluent than either one of the other two. Baldwin County, being a large school system with a large number of units, would be on the upper end of that. So, for example, Mountain Brook's total units is 278.18. Total salaries for those units is $17.5 million. Fringe benefits is 6.93. So the fringe benefits includes retirement, it includes unemployment compensation, it includes the health insurance, it includes the allowed days off multiplied by the $120 a day. Other current expenses is a flat amount, as I said, $6,417,000. And then there's the breakdown of the other current expenses and how much each one of those generates for the schools. If you look at the 100, it's for professional development, it's $100 per unit, 27,818, which is basically just 100 multiplied by the 278.18. So the total cost for Mountain Brook and the foundation program is $31.1 million. Their 10 mills is roughly 7.4, so the state picks up the delta, $24 million. And that's just how it works in every one of the cases. If you look on the far right in Lowndes County, less affluent, they only have 83 total units. The total cost of their foundation program is a whole lot less. It's barely over $9 million, but their 10 mills only generates $1.3 million. So the state picks up $7.7 million of the cost because it's a less affluent school system whose property value is worth less than other similarly sized entities. Have any? Yes, sir.
Yeah, be sure you use your microphone, okay? Yeah.
23.6% is what Mountain Brook contributes to the overall foundation program for their school district, and 14.5% is what the contribution is for Lowndes County locally versus the total foundation program.
It's less than 20 on the Baldwin County one. I don't have the number in my head. I don't do math in my head. I learned a long time ago. I got a calculator for that. But anyway, that's how it works. That's the foundation program formula and how it works to determine how much the total cost is for the foundation program to each individual LEA, and their share of the total cost is determined by the value of 10 mills worth of district school tax within their LEA. The state picks up the rest. And what I wanted to show you in regards to that, if you'll look at the budget information that I handed you. The pages that come straight out of the budget. No one really ever pays a whole lot of attention to this except for me and the people that actually have to work the foundation program across the street. But the first line on, the first number on line 121, a highlighted foundation program, that's the formula. As state and local amounts, 5.4. Again, this is for fiscal '25. This is the budget that you just passed. Everything that drives that number in the foundation program line is in the guts of the rest of this portion of the budget. If you look on lines 561 on page 21, it talks about the school nurse program. Again, that's not within the foundation program. That's a separate thing, but it gets into how those nurses are allocated and what drives the cost of the nurses. There's a separate line for that and the source of funds that funds those. Cybersecurity, lines, beginning line 625, the language below that determines how that money's allocated. Again, it's not within the foundation program formula. It's a separate categorical grant. Current units, line 637, that $2 million talks about the startup and conversion costs for public charter schools. All the numbers beginning on line 20, on page 25, are basically that's the math and science teacher salary matrix, which you just did a few years back, but it's got its own salary matrix, which is separate and apart from the normal salary matrix. Really wanted to point out what starts on page 29. That's the guts of what drives this. So beginning on line 726, it talks about the above appropriation is distributed by the State Board of Education in accordance to sections 1613, 230 through 239. That is the foundation program statute. In other words, you really can't, when doing the budget, you can't really do anything other than what's outlined within the foundation program. You can adjust these because they're in the budget document every year. But you can't go sideways of that and say, well, we don't want to do the foundation program, we want to do something else. This is what drives the foundation program and the basic funding for the schools. Beginning on 737, foundation program calculations are based on the funding divisors set forth below. So there's the divisors that drive the 2025 total number of units for each classification, each grade unit. And then following that is the salary matrix for the teachers that drives the salary part of the foundation program. And then later on, beginning on page 34, line 851, it talks about for fringe benefit. It outlines exactly in the budget document every year what the fringe benefit costs are, how much they're going to be for each one of those teacher units for the salaries. So it lays in to the teacher retirement system cost, the SEI, the PHIP cost, and the other costs associated with fringe benefits. And then beginning on line 60, it talks about the classroom instructional support. These items outlined on here with regard to student materials, technology, and all of that are outlined in that language beginning on line 860. Again, this is a different year, so they may be a little different than the ones that are up there. So that's how the foundation program works. And again, that is not everything that goes into K-12 funding. If you look at the spreadsheet that I gave you, I condensed that down to just what the local Board of Education line is, and also included the State Department line. State Department's line is $707 million on top of the foundation program total. But again, that's not the total K-12. There are various things scattered throughout the budget that are also considered K-12 that you may or may not have to worry about if you go down the student-based model, but just something to keep in mind.
Kirk, Mr. Chairman, can I ask a question here? If we were to look at the basic understanding of the divisor numbers, that is saying that for K through 3, for example, 14.25. So for every 14.25 students in that school system in K through 3, that school system would be credited with 1 teacher unit.
Yeah, that's the way it works.
Except that I don't know of any K through 3 classrooms that have 14 students. Most of them have more than 14.
But again, I also want to point out that that is not classroom sizes. That is just the divisors that get to the units. That's not equivalent to.
Right, so that gives you the units, but then the units can be done, can be implemented differently throughout school systems. So, to meet needs of different schools that are growing faster than other schools, and we can't keep up with them with the foundation program, so they have to move teacher units from one school to another school in order to meet the needs of a growing population area.
A lot of that is done with local unit, local support. They have more flexibility there than they do within the foundation program. But yes, the ultimate discretion in terms of how the money, once they receive it, is laid out, as long as it's within the parameters of the foundation program allowable uses, is up to the local entity, which also brings to the point about transparency and what you can and cannot see. You appropriate money, but at the end of the day, you're not, directing exactly what the end result of that is at the local level.
There's no state law requirement of classroom size.
Except for, I think it was Career Tech, this 1,000, is that right? State board, it's more as a policy as opposed to a state law that outlines how much.
So in K through 12, I mean, other than this career thing, our classroom sizes, that's going to be totally up to the locals.
You can drive some of that through the divisors. If you lower divisors, it increases the number of units
Right.
at the local level. So that's in years past, historically, that's how you've addressed that either up or down, is by changing the divisors for an individual grade unit or across the board. It's complicated.
Was there not a federal requirement on class size at some point, or am I,
There was.
no?
No.
What's the Smith Act? What am I think? Why does that come to my mind?
That's not one I'm familiar with. Are you?
Okay. All right. Thank you.
We'll look at that and let you know. Oh, all right. So I think we're also going to talk about the primary funding models used in other states. I think this data is from a different source, so it doesn't fully align with 41 and 6 that I referred to earlier, but it's 36 student-based systems, 9 resource-based systems. This is the Education Commission of the States, a 50-state comparison, and 4 hybrids, including Georgia has a hybrid system, which has components of both. Resource-based, in the Southeast, it looks like us in North Carolina, and you'd have to debate whether North Carolina is Southeast. So hybrid, Georgia has a hybrid system. Student-based systems, Arkansas, Florida, Kentucky. So basically,
Can you define the hybrid system a little bit better? Flesh that out for us.
I've got a slide in a
Okay.
minute that may get into a little bit of that. All I think off what I remember is it has resource-based components as well as student-based components for individual things.
So Kurt, they're just going back to the basic thing to make sure I understand. So in a resource-based system, someone, in this case a state, determines how much the cost is basically should be for education that we're allocating. And we're allocating that based upon heads, but we've made some determination on how many, that also contemplates how many teachers are required, how much support staff is required, how much support services is required, all those things. So basically, here's the pot of money, and we've identified what you need to use it for. In a student-based situation, you're looking more at the needs of each individual. You're giving the systems more discretion as to how to allocate that based on their needs. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, and just for context, the history of a resource-based system was a southern state thing following reclamation, and it's based on the property values, and all of that's intertwined in to a resource-based system. Other states had different components of their resource base before they switched over. Ours is just the traditional model of we determine what the total cost is, the total revenues necessary to fund it for each individual system, and your share of the cost is
So for example, this is just I'm just thinking out loud here, but if you had on a resource-based system, under our form, we've determined how many teachers you need, how many support staff you need, okay, 30 years ago, that was the model we set up. Technology has changed a lot of things. A lot of things have changed. So right now, we're still locked into if you have this, you must have this, right? Whereas if these student-based situations, some schools may need more or less teachers or support staff or a combination thereof, right?
That's true, or different types of teachers, or
Right.
different types of units, and the student-based model lets you identify that a little better than what the resource-based system. Resource-based system does apply multipliers for special needs, but that multiplier doesn't necessarily drive the services being provided or who gets them or all of the above. So, again, that's who has what around us. So on a student-based system, you start with a base amount generally. Those base amounts obviously have a wide-ranging beginning point. Georgia's base that they use on their student-based part for 24 was a little over $3,000. Just for context, if you took our foundation program state amount and divided that by the total ADMs, it would produce a little less than $7,000 here, if that's what you wanted to start with on a current year basis. Kentucky's is 4,200. Then you have wide-ranging ones, 8,600. Maryland, Mississippi starting point is 6,750. But it's discretionary. I guess that can change. There's a consumer price index factor into Maryland's. So I'm giving you all this to say there's not a one-size-fits-all base amount. It varies from state to state, and I have to guess that it varies from state to state. Oklahoma's is just tragically low. I'd have to think that it varies that much from state to state depending upon what else they add to that base amount. Obviously, the more multipliers, the more things you add to it, the higher the cost, and if you can't afford to fund it on an ongoing basis from a higher base amount, you have to start with a lower base and add the multipliers to that point.
Kurt, I had a question. When you talk about the 7,000, is that just the foundation program, or is that the school's portion, systems portion of those other outside?
No, that's just the formula number divided by the ADMs.
Thank
And I just provided that for context. Now, whether you want to start there, do something different, I don't know.
But that was
But
just
that's
foundation
foundation
funding.
program. It doesn't include the transportation of
Right.
technology. So again, to some extent, you have to understand this. Even in a student-based model, it's not going to pick up all of the other things that you've got spread out throughout education. You have to decide, all right, we're going to do this, but we're also going to continue to do that, or we're going to do a portion of that, or we're going to do something different. So those are part of the decision that you'd have to make in order to move forward on something like this. Again, now that you have a copy, I won't spend so much time reading this to you, but this outlines what the southeastern states have in terms of what they're doing on special education, what they're doing on low-income students. We have several at-risk programs, 3, one within the foundation program that's supposed to be at least $100 per student at risk, 2 other programs that are allocated based on free and reduced lunch and economic disadvantaged students. That may be a factor you want to consider adding into what a student-based model. Special education, as I indicated earlier, Tennessee's is rather complicated on the special education model. They've got, I think it's 7 different multipliers that they use based on the individual special education need of the student. But we have other states, as you can see this, I think they have a single weight that they apply for special education, be that 40%, 20%, 150% in Louisiana, but it's not broken down by the individual autistic kid, individual kid with special needs in a wheelchair, blind or otherwise disabled. It's just a flat multiplier that's applied. Again, this is a continuation of that. And this is just looking at the special needs and the low-income components. Didn't look at any of the other components, but obviously, if you're building a system and you're controlling what the inputs are, you can control what you want to put in there and how you want to get results on the other side of that as well.
So Kirk, if we were to move to a student-based system entirely, our budget spreadsheet would look different. It would have less line items, right?
Well,
Because some of the things that we line item today would be
Yes.
included in the foundation and would not be necessarily.
that would be entirely driven by you, right? So we've got a high need special education grant program, we've got an ELL grant program, we've got 2 different at-risk programs. Assumedly, if you included all of that within your base model, you wouldn't have the need for those separate line items in the budget anymore. They would be a part of the bigger number. As far as you can call it foundation program, you call it something else. I think you probably want to call it something else.
Okay.
But yes, that's certainly the case.
Back to special needs really quick. Am I correct in recalling that we basically put a generic 5% of the student population in a given system? We just assume 5% are special needs, and then we use this 2.5 multiplier by that number.
That's right.
And we have no bearing on the degree of special needs
No.
or anything.
It's not a factor in driving the additional the divisors. But apparently we have the information so we can do something, a separate calculation to see. I mean, just for context, if you take that, and not your question, but I was just on my mind, if you took that 723,000, multiplied it by 7,000, that would give you your base amount for what the new program would be, if that's what you decided to do. You currently appropriate $17.4 million for that high-need special ed program. All of those things together that we mentioned, the at-risk, the ELL, all of those things, if they were incorporated as they are into a program, it would only be about $140 million. But that is not to the level of what a student base would do in terms of an additional multiplier to a base for each individual of those kids that would be covered by that. So the cost would go up, without a doubt, it would go up. I've got some thoughts and ways that you might be able to do that if you decide to go down this path. You understand there's several different avenues to get there. I'll let you continue to read as far as what the special education issues are in other states
Kurt,
as
on
well
the,
as low income. Yes, sir.
I know we're talking about the foundation program, but on the, for the special needs and free and reduced lunch, the money that comes from the feds, totally separate, and I guess is, not considered in any.
It's not even in that portion of the budget that I showed you. It's under the State Department's budget.
But this is what we do as a state additionally.
Total cost, that's right.
What's
Total
that?
cost of the foundation, total cost of the foundation program and direct support to the local boards of education.
Okay.
The main portion of that is the foundation program. These individual other.
Kurt, can you speak in the microphone better, please?
The total cost of what you give to the local boards of education is the foundation program plus those individual other items, transportation, at-risk, those other things. They get a portion of each one of those as well. So the total of what you give them is the sum of all of that, which is separate and apart from what they get for reading initiative, for numeracy, for all of the other things which are under the State Department's budget.
Okay, but as far as the special needs, what Troy was saying earlier, it's just we assume from the state portion that we give for special needs, we assume 5% of every school district's population is special needs, and then we use a 2.5 multiplier.
You do something similar on career tech, but that only applies to middle school and high school. And that gets you to divisors. That's what you're, adding that to, which drives the number of units. But in terms of the backside, is there a correlation with that much more money that's used for special needs, that's used for I don't know that you can draw a bright line to any of that.
Yeah, it seems kind of hard to believe that we just are. I mean, I heard you talking earlier about getting into, if we went to this, and Chairman Garrett, about if we went into this student formula, that we could even identify the types of needs of a special needs student.
Right.
But I'm surprised. I guess that I didn't realize that we're just assuming. I mean, if a school system has 10% special needs, for example, but we're only saying 5%, we're really putting a burden on that
I
system.
think you all collectively have heard quite a bit recently from the special ed community about just that very fact. About how the cost of providing the services are so much more than they're actually getting from the state.
Yes,
that they're actually
we have.
covering.
Representative Falter, you remember the meeting we have with the Jefferson
right.
County CFOs, the District 5 CFOs, this was pointed out how expensive that was.
Which is why you now have that high needs special ed grant program, but it's only $17.5 million. In no way could that be enough money to provide the adequate services or the services for what they're costing for the kids that would fall in any one of those categories. It's a categorical grant that goes back out to the school systems.
Is there federal funding that follows that type student as well?
I think there's rehab services funding as well as some additional IDA federal money. That's right, it all comes through.
But what we heard from our CFOs in our district were that it was still out of pocket, pretty substantial.
Kirk, can you talk about the original lawsuit that set up the foundation program briefly, and why that was, and how it was resolved, if it has been?
All right.
And then does that, are there any implications of that lawsuit as far as us being student-based or resource-based funding? Is there anything ongoing about that?
Possibly. So going back to 1990, don't throw anything at me. So 1990, there was a local group of 25 that decided to sue the state because of the equity funding issue, the fact that they weren't guaranteed a right to an education. There was a separate group who had a similar interest with regard to special needs kids. Those two cases were combined ultimately. We lost. We appealed a lot. 1993, they ruled that the liability portion, so in other words, we weren't getting out of that. We lost. We have to provide an equitable funding system or equitable education for all students within the state of Alabama. The foundation program came about due to the remedy phase, which got set aside. No one has challenged the foundation program in terms of how it addressed the original issue, but the case kind of is set aside. Could it be brought back up? It absolutely could, depending upon how a student-based system is viewed in regards to providing the services on an equitable basis. Kirk's opinion, and that doesn't mean anything with regard to the court, but if you're funding a flat amount per student and then addressing their individual education needs on top of that, you're treating everybody the same. Everybody the same without regard to what the value of their meal is, without regard to, everybody is treated the same. Every head has a whatever dollar figure attached to it, and plus whatever it takes to actually provide the services to that individual student. So I fully expect somebody would readdress the issue. I don't think that they're going to win, but I could be entirely wrong. Right? I didn't throw anything, so I guess that was an oversimplification of a long legal dispute that was appealed multiple times. So. Any other?
Kirk, do you have or maybe some of the folks from the schools have an idea? I think we have 140-something school systems in the state. What percentage of those school systems have local funding above and beyond their 10 mills that allow them to participate in the foundation program?
That's a really good question. It also speaks to the affluent issue, but just in a different manner. Some systems, as you indicated, some, including the two that I put up there on the more affluent side, have other local funds that they have in addition to what they have to put in to pay the cost of the foundation program. Those local funds are basically used for whatever they want to use them for. And some schools, even if they had local funds in addition to their 10 mills, it wouldn't generate enough money to do a whole lot of other stuff. Or even, in some cases, I can speak to my county. I live in Autauga County. My daughter's about to graduate from Prattville High School. It's a 7A school in the state of Alabama. It's the lowest funded 7A school in the state of Alabama with 10 mills, and they were forced to levy the 3 to get to 10. But
Very
they
similar
want
to Elmore County.
But they want to
next door.
compare themselves to the Mountain Brooks and the other places of the world that have all the funding that they've decided to fund on their own. So very big issue with regard. So we're not looking at the entire picture. You're looking at the foundation program formula part of it. There are various local entities that have additional local money that they can add to this that actually allows them more flexibility than what the foundation program allows them.
Kurt, would you say
I
that
don't
the
know that that would be-
majority are county systems that only have the 10 mil?
I would suspect. Now, that's a good question. Do you? Yes. 17 county systems? If you can't hear that, Brandon says about 17 systems that only have
10.
only have 10.
17 out of all of them. That's slower than I thought. Thank you.
Oh, the delta is $2 billion. In other words, there's $2 billion worth of local money that is levied for schools that is not factored into the foundation program or the match requirements or anything that go into that. It's just money that's retained at the local level to be used for education.
Mr. Chairman, I'm gonna wait because I like the train of thought that my colleagues are asking regarding. But I have some questions to ask him that may take us a little bit off the track what we on right now. Not what we're here for, but on that track. So would you recognize me before you close them out? Just recognize me before you close them out.
Sure. I think we're just a grab bag right now as questions come because this is helpful. Because members, we've got to educate ourselves if you're not familiar with the foundation program. And so you've got foundation programs, how we spend the money. Then you've got the revenue, how we collect the money. And those are two, I'll call them different issues. They're related, but they're different. And if we're going to get into the revenue, we just need to know that that's out there. The 10 mills and the winners and losers, as Representative said, the counties that are more than 10 mills are giving in more to the foundation program than they're getting back, or losing, I guess, are net contributors to the foundation program.
Yeah, well, you now have the example that nobody ever envisioned of a local system that generates more money than it costs to run their foundation program. The law never contemplated that. It just said the total cost minus the local equals what the state pays. Well, what if your total minus the local is a negative? Orange Beach. They have a small number of kids and a large property value, so they generate more money than they need to run the foundation program. And it's fixed going forward about how they get to retain that money, but that's certainly something that wasn't contemplated 30 years ago.
So to be clear, the foundation money is they're only using the 10 mills. So anything above 10 mills, if a local has a 5 mil for schools, that 5 mills is not going into the foundation. Only the 10 mil goes in foundation. The state sends back the
That's
remainder
true.
per student.
And I think a clarifying point, just for reference, there are no local monies sent to the state. They determine what the total cost is. They expect the locals to pay the 10% cost. The state sends the rest on a monthly basis. The state never receives any of the local money. It just reduces the amount the state has to give to an individual LEA based on what the value of that 10 mills is. Now, if you have, as you indicated, if you have an additional 5 mills, 10 mills, that's entirely up to the local government, local LEA in terms of how they want to use that money.
Do you have I'm not trying to be critical, but a better example than this one as for members to have as far as how the tax collection, the 10 mills work, and where you got some systems that are, net contributors and some that get a lot more than they put in,
Right.
and some get back a lot less than they put in.
We can run that for any individual LEA. The information's available for all of them. So if you have a handful you want us to look at that you think are,
Not so much the LEAs, but just how just school system A and school system B, and show how that money flow washes down to Montgomery and washes back up, or doesn't.
yeah, we can give you a better example of that. It's the pie chart, but broken down further. I worked on something yesterday that I didn't include, but I probably should have now. So we'll get that to you.
Mr. Chairman, if I might add an example, I apologize for talking so much, but I like this topic. So I was the chairman of a county commission for 6 years, and we did like every county commission does. We sought economic development, and oftentimes we would abate taxes, property taxes, except for school property taxes, because you can't abate those. And we always were under the impression that, wow, we bring in an industry and they pay $200,000 of property taxes to our schools. We felt like we were improving our local schools because we were bringing in more money. However, Elmore County is only a participant in the foundation program with our 10 mills. We do not have any local funding. So because of that, all we were really doing was lowering the amount the state contributed to Elmore County. So we did a good job of bringing in economic development, raising more property taxes for our schools, but it really didn't move the needle for our schools. All it did was lower the amount of money the state paid to make us whole. So there's really no incentive for that outside of if you have locally levied property taxes, then that may add money. But really all you're doing is lowering the burden that the state has because you're doing more locally. So as certain areas of our state grow and have more industry and more property tax and their mill increases in value, while it all obviously changes every year and increases, as we saw on one of your tables, net neutral, when we have those increases locally, if we're only a 10 mill county or a 10 mill school system, then we're not increasing funding to our local school. We are just changing the way the state has to accommodate us to reach the foundation level. And I think when you look at that alone, that's why you have the huge discrepancies. And ultimately, it's pretty frustrating as local officials.
Now, Representative, you're not thinking about all those sales taxes those employees brought into the county, or those income taxes.
Well, I'm speaking specifically about schools. So all those other things are great, and I am not in any way minimizing economic development. But our superintendent would come to everyone. He would go to the revenue commissioner and ask, how much more money are they paying? And under the impression that it would move the needle locally, and it really doesn't.
So,
Mr. Chairman.
Can I piggyback on what Representative just said, please? Because it's almost in looking at the examples that you gave of Baldwin, Lowndes County, and Mountain Brook, it's almost as locally, because I've been on the end of a renewal as well as a millage increase in Mobile, it's almost it's what you want to make it. And I'm with the senator. There's a whole, you said it doesn't involve the schools, but it does. There's a whole lot more money that's going to be coming in for sales tax, sales taxes and other incentives, tourism and so forth and so forth. So it's almost, I don't think the law, and listening to the history, the law did not take into effect that we'd have this problem now. Would you say that, Kurt?
Which problem?
Well, it's sort of a menagerie of all kinds of things happening in all of our local systems. I was looking at the 17 county systems that have the 10 meals, and they may get above. And I'm thinking for us, in my local community, it's all in what we wanted to make education to be in our community. That's kind of where we, I think that's what we drove for. We wanted a better school system that would be able to attract those industries and as well as educate a skilled task workforce.
So here's my comment, and I'm staying away from anything related to economic development, but let's talk economic development, right? If you generate X amount of additional income taxes or state sales taxes, that just goes into the pot, and the K-12 portion of that pot is roughly 73%, but as it get back to directly into your community from that point, and I'll challenge you and say it probably doesn't on a dollar for dollar basis because of the way the foundation program works, it will not let it get back to you unless there's also a correlation in terms of an increase in the number of kids you've got going to your schools. Locally, if you have local sales taxes, if you have local property taxes, then any of that economic activity is retained at the local level. So yes, it benefits the local in that regard, but in terms of the state money, it's just part of the pot, and the pot gets split the way the foundation program dictates, and you may or may not get it back directly as you think.
Mr.
And
Chairman.
that's not me opining, that's just how the foundation program works.
Senator Smithers?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I just want to say I'm glad to see us here. I really am. I don't know how many of you all were here 30 years ago, but I know two of us was here, and that was Senator Wagner and myself. We were part of that group that established this foundation program under Governor Farb James. So I'm glad to see us 30 years later get to this point. And you and my colleagues in here, and you mentioned many of the problems and pitfalls and downfalls that we're facing and having to look and adjust. One of the things I heard from the, and I'm not putting words in his mouth, but it's just the way I interpret it, from the gentleman from Elmo County and from Representative Faulkner. He was talking about the disabled. He was the one talking about the disabled devices, and the gentleman from Elmo County was talking about the money getting back. And of course, you expound on that. One of the things I think that what I see taking place here is that this is a program. We're looking at the program to ultimately get to where we can adequately address those issues as we go forward with those issues. I've heard different issues from disabled and all the other areas. But the other thing that I think that we've got to look at is getting people up to that baseline. Then start talking about doing this stuff we're talking in here. Because if we do this in here, the people who are down here, because we're going to do all this here and raise it here, they still hadn't gotten here where they got to get academically. We have 206 schools in this system that are failing, 206. And we've got to figure out how we going to get them 206 up above failing before we can come in on some standard amount of money that we're giving people. Because all we're doing is just making ourselves feel good with the standard amount that we should feel good. But we're not going to pull those schools out with just raising a better formula here. We've got to be able to do that. So with that in mind, can you share, for my sake, I hope everybody else, if they're interested, but mine, how the program worked that the governor has set up where she provided funds for a select number of schools in this state and the amount that was designated for those. And the reason I say that because I have two of them in my system. And, just for everybody in here, I know we visualize systems, but I represent the second and the third largest school system in the state of Alabama. That's Jefferson and Birmingham. So I see it from a big perspective and from a small perspective. I represent Irondale, so I see it from both ends. But I do know that whatever she did, it allowed the resources for those schools, and one of them has about 40% Hispanics. And the funds that she provided, and I would like to know even the guidelines, whatever that was, it provided a mechanism that those schools now are not failing schools. And it's because they had enough resources for their problem to set up whatever they had to and to get those kids to that level. So could you do that?
Yeah, I think you're referring to the underperforming school grant program.
Yes.
And I would really defer to the State Department in terms of the parameters on that. That was a $10 million grant program that was initially targeted towards a pilot program, initially targeted toward individual schools that were underperforming. It provided some additional coaches, some additional ADMs and funding, obviously, to try to address their individual needs. And as far as the guidelines and stuff, Brandon, would you like to talk about the guidelines on the underperforming school?
I can talk about the funding piece.
Senator Smitherman, can I just answer a question? So maybe I heard what you said, but I think one of the things in these student-based formulas is not just changing the way you allocate the pot, it's really how that pot is what the system receives is based upon its needs, okay, which is I think what you're talking about. And like, for example, in the definition here, it mentions that in many states, additional funds are allocated to district based on individual learning needs of students, such as low income, disability, and or status as English learner. So right now, our state formula doesn't really consider any of those factors. We just basically look at head count. I'm generalizing here. But I think if you look at a student-based system, you're scoring determine that system needs based upon what is its poverty level, because there's a correlation between poverty and the learning. What is the ESL? In other words, you're looking more at the student needs as opposed to the resources we predetermine that every system has to have. Does that make sense? I guess what I'm saying is I think that it's more than just changing the formula. I think that's what that formula is designed to do.
I understand what you're saying, but the problem I see with that is that when you take in all those factors, then we have this model that applies to say if these students are under poverty, this situation. So now we have this model applies, but it may take very much more resources at this particular place than what this formula. I keep going back. That's still a formula. What the formula is going to produce for that particular system of school, it's going to take more money than that, and that's what I'm making reference to. We still can't take this system and fix. In other words, I just picked the school name out. I mean, the teacher of the year came from the school. That we can't do that to fix Washington. We can help Washington,
right,
but we'll never get them up. They're up there now because the governor gave them the necessary funds. But we're talking about those schools are having. I don't know. He can correct me because he's the funding man.
Yeah.
But it was 500,000, $1 million. It was somewhere all, and just for the one school. And that's what I'm saying. We got to get them schools there. So I know we want to do the perfect model thing and walk out of here, and we should. But to those schools, we got to find some one-time money to get them. It's kind of like when you fix a car and you don't have no car note, you can pay the car note. When the car breaks down, you got to have that extra money to fix it and still pay the car note. We need that extra money to get to fix it so we can keep it fixed. This just keeps it fixed. And tries to fix it because there's not enough revenue. But if we can get them there, this will work, what we're trying to do in here.
So I'll just respond this way. That program that you're referring to is outside of the foundation program now. It can either be included or left remaining outside, and you continue to fund it. If you continue to fund it, it would operate the same way going forward. It could be included in a multiplier in terms of the student base, but or it can stay outside and remain funded the way it's currently funded. There's so many programs that are outside of the foundation program, that being one. If you look at the State Department portion of our spreadsheet, I think it goes on for 4 pages. Most of those are programs that are outside of the realm of the foundation program. They're categorical need program, they're individual pass-through grant programs, or various other types of programs, but they're not the foundation program. They're just additions to giving money to K-12 schools, and that one's a targeted K-12 school grant program for the underperforming schools.
You may not know the answer to this, and I probably wouldn't expect you to, but I'll ask it anyway. And it's probably one for the consultant that we'll hear from next meeting in August. And the question is, are you familiar with any of these student-based funding formulas that have an accountability aspect to them? In other words, if we're going to give you more resources for these particular children, let's say EL, then you need to have them up able to pass I think it's called the access test, or I don't know, but, be able to pass the test within 3 years, 4 years, or whatever. Is there any state that has some strings attached to the funding?
Yeah, there are many states that have some real transparency tied to the student-based model. Specifically, I think Tennessee has got a transparency aspect tied to the ELL as well as the special needs portion. I'm sure there are other states. That's part of the reason why you would do something like this. If you're targeting funding toward an individual issue, you need to know if that's actually solving the problem or if you're just putting money on top of money.
What is the stick, if you will, to get the outputs that we want rather than just throwing money at the problem and hoping for the best?
Hey, you can set it up, and I'll refer back to Mark if he has any more comments, but you can set it up any way you want to. Again, you would have to pass a law to set this program up and replace the one that you've got. So within that program, you absolutely can require some reporting, some transparency, some clawbacks in the event that there's something that doesn't happen the way you want to happen. I mean, it's entirely up to you to set up the program the way you want to set it up.
Kirk, it would seem that the reason we have so many line items on our budget is because the foundation program isn't flexible enough to adapt as time moves forward. So technology over the last 30 years has obviously changed and impacted education. So we have all these different line items, but if we were to move to a student-based funding mechanism, we can set the framework, and then if it's determined 10 years from now that the cost to educate a special needs student is higher than we anticipated, or if federal funding increases and we don't need to do as much local funding, we then can just adjust the modifier, the factor that we're applying to that particular need from 1.5 to 1.6. and make that modest change within the legislature to adapt to needs as they change. Because 20 years ago, I don't think English as a second language was nearly as much of a need as it is now in Alabama.
Right.
So, but the foundation program had no mechanism to do that, so all we did was just keep adding line items.
No, the foundation program law itself outlined what a lot of these things had to be. Transportation is in the foundation program law, but it's a categorical thing. It's outside of the formula. But it did not get into the detail that you have to get into to do a student-based kind of thing. The student-based model can absolutely be adjusted within the budget document. Each budget stands on its own as for that particular fiscal year. If you go into a fiscal year and needs have changed where you don't need to do a 150% multiplier for special needs, you can do a 125% multiplier and still cover all the cost. You can readdress that to another area, increase the multiplier there, or just don't, add that to the bottom line. Ideally, what's going to have to be factored in, right now the current model funds pay raises. So here's what happens behind the scenes and how you get to what I gave you a copy of. So each year the governor, in building her budget, decides if she's going to do a pay raise. She already knows going in what the ADM count is, and the department knows how many of those are for each individual school. So she goes in and decides if she wants to do a pay raise. If she does a pay raise, you go to that salary matrix for the teachers, and you increase all those numbers by 2% across the board, and it generates a number for salaries. You also know what the benefits figures are going to be, because those are outlined in the budget instructions to the agencies. You know what the PHIP number is, you know what the retirement costs are going to be, and then do the multiplier. So what she or you have real control over is whether, number one, you want to increase or decrease the pay raise amount. Again, you do that in a separate bill. You can't give a pay raise in the budget. You can fund the pay raise, and that's your only option there. But if you decide to increase it, you have to add the number to the salaries number. Again, that will also increase the benefits number. What you spend most of your time addressing or changing is these classroom instructional support numbers, which you have control over. Again, it's in the budget document. If you want technology to be 1,000 instead of 500, we just change the number in the budget, and it generates a new number for the foundation program model. Again, same thing on student growth, if you wanted to increase that, same thing on any of these other factors. OCE is the one that we go up and down and up and down and up and down on, simply because it's for everything, right? It's anything that's not salaries. You can't cut salaries. You can't reduce benefits. There's a reason why you can, it's constitutional. But these other things, you have fungible ability to go up, down, sideways, anything you want to do on those other components, and every time you do, we have to go in on our side, the things that we can control. We can't control the ADM side, that's the department side, and how the money is actually allocated. That's entirely what on the department side. The things that we can change and see what a new number is like student materials and technology and stuff. So that's how you get to the information that is in the body of the budget, is in the process of your decisions, the governor's decisions, and how you get to the bottom line. But the formula itself doesn't change because the law outlines what the formula is.
Mr. Chairman, let me respond to your question about accountability. You get accountability based on what you see with those students. And what we have often said is that while money is not a panacea to the problem, we do know what happens when you don't have it. And I've taught in school systems like Connecticut where that education cost-sharing formula has worked to correct that state's arbitrary distribution of state funds in a way that I think we're after here, because one of the things that they were seeking to do was to get beyond those funds would go to school districts based on the learning needs of students and the financial needs of the community. So that was a strategy that was used. And I do see, because I do tend to pay attention to these things, like to kind of mark them up, the piece that comes from the governor's office relating to establishing this committee. I love this language, a study on modernizing K through 12 education funding. Here's a line where you're saying transitioning from a resource-based funding model to one that is student-based and provides greater flexibility. So I'm interested in hearing what is that flexibility? Because he who starts last in the race has to run much swifter to catch up. I think that's part of what I heard Senator Smitherman mentioning. And frankly speaking, you know, as an educator, Kirk, I'm completely confused right now. It feels like I'm in a math class. And that's no fault of, you know, you're my name, I'm your namesake. Everything is always going to be good with you. But what are we trying to do? What is this commission seeking to do? And is it what I just mentioned? This transitioning from a resource-based funding model to one that is student-based. And before I stop, let me say that 3 years ago, right here in Montgomery, that I represent, about 88% of this city, and we were well below 10 mils. And it's some funding, it's funding that I sponsored, HB 500. And we went through a battle to get that funding. up to the point where at least it's reasonably acceptable and still not quite there. But I was struck by real numbers because here in Montgomery, at that time 3 years ago, per pupil, we were looking at $924 per student. And same Pike Road, 2024, 2000 something per student. Auburn City Schools, about $3,000 and some change. I heard the reference to Mountain Brook, 7,000 and some change. I've looked at some numbers today here at Montgomery Public Schools, and the reading scores are up, I think, by 27% in one category. I know what happens when you put some money behind it, because you can also maybe get some quality people to work in those systems to make that happen. And so that becomes its own accountability. So I'm grateful for this conversation, because I do believe it's on the way to hopefully a good outcome. And before I part Mr. Chairman, I think Senator Smitherman and Senator Wagner, you all, the foundation, what was the conclusion about why the foundation needed to be established? Did that have anything to do with inequitable distribution within our state school systems?
I think it's in part of what Kurt was saying about the lawsuit. I mean, we were at that point, the state was at that point,
And the purpose
that they had to
what was-
establish an equitable and fair system. And I think that was one of the charges that we were charged with, be able to establish a system that would be more equitable.
And that was,
system that we
you
had.
said that was in 1990?
It was actually 94
Yeah.
94.
when we actually met. It was
The-
summer. I think it was around July of 1994, right after the primaries.
The first lawsuit, or 1990, developed the foundation program as a part of the remedy phase. There was back and forth about whether the judicial branch had the authority to actually do what they were initially setting out to do, which was set up the funding system for K-12 education. So the foundation program was the law that the executive and legislative branch came up with to respond to the remedy issue.
That was kind of close to this idea of education cost sharing, of some aspect of that kind of formula?
Yes, it was the equitable issue. That's one of the reasons why the foundation program is the way it is now. But we've had a foundation program all the way back to 1935. It was the original 35, which is what they were suing about.
Okay, anybody have another comment? All right, it's been an hour and a half. We're kind of we're on time, an hour and a half to 2 hours. So thank you, Mr. Fulford. You will get us that information about the breakdown on the, as far as the local millage and how that works. I've seen some.
We can give you a report that shows state versus local for all the LEAs if you want.
Well, just how it's calculated and
Mr. Chairman?
I've seen that before, Ms.
Those
Collins.
large books that we get from the School Board Association have that by each system, I believe.
In the budget handbook?
No,
big
the
one
large
from
thing we
ASB.
get from the School Board Association.
Okay, the big spiral bound.
Correct.
Thank you, School Board Association. Maybe you can help with Mr. Fulford get that back out to us. I knew I'd seen it somewhere. So this is what Chairman Garrett, and he'll have the final word. We'll meet again probably the last half of August. Until then, my summer challenges, and I know you'll all be sitting on the beach reading about the foundation program and about student-based funding alternatives or programs. But educate yourself on this, and we will have
a consultant that Chairman Garrett and I have been discussing this with present to us in August if this task force wanted to go farther, what would it look like if we did go to a student-based funding model? Now, there are scores of ways to go about it, as far as how you weight and what categories, et cetera. So there are a lot of deviations. You heard about Georgia even having a hybrid model where, it's still some foundation and some student-based. Arguably, we kind of have a hybrid model ourselves with our at-risk funding pot, our ELL funding pot, our special needs funding pot. Now, they're not significant in the grand scheme of things, but they are there and they continue to grow. So we're kind of doing that on an ad hoc basis today, but it's not in a very thoughtful way. So, Chairman Garrett, I don't know. Oh, and one other thing. For those in the Ed family out here, we appreciate your input. I know the governor's office is also interested in this topic, and as you talk to members over the summer, feel free to visit with them regarding your thoughts on this. Ultimately, your decision makers sit before you, and we'll be making the call on whether we want to pursue this or not. And but we value your input and your certainly wisdom in how we fund our schools and how we collect the money to fund our schools. Chairman Garrett?
Yeah, thank you again for being here today. I think you can see your appetite's probably whetted just a bit to see how complex this issue is, and questions lead to more and more questions. One thing I want to say again is we've not made any decisions. We're trying to gather information, gather the facts. We do know that everybody else in the country is moving in this type of direction. We're one of 6 that's left behind. We're all aware of where our state stacks up on the national rankings when it comes to education. The governor's indicated she wants to be at number 30 pretty quickly. And obviously it's going to take some change for us to get to that point, and not looking at something for 30 years, I think, makes sense that we do that. I hesitate to say this because I may be misspeaking, but I think that from what I've read and some of my research on this was that early on, the focus when we did the foundation program change 30 years ago was the focus was on equity. And I think that's been accomplished, but I think now the focus is really on adequacy. Are we really getting the results we need 30 years later down the road with that model? And again, no foregone conclusions, but all the surrounding states have gone. Mississippi, which tends to be in front of us lately in more recent years in terms of educational changes, has gone to this type of approach as well. So I think it's just information we've got to have. But one thing we're not looking at doing is taking from one group and giving to another group. We're trying to figure out what is a model that accomplishes the growth, the progression in education that we all want to see, and certainly in those areas that really need it the most. So appreciate you, Chairman Orr, for leading on this, and we look forward to the next meeting, and that's all I have to say.
Adjourned.
Thank you. We're adjourned. Thank you.